Dr. Harold Fenwick stood before the hospital's forgotten wing, a crumbling relic hidden in plain sight. The darkened corridor was a part of the building that shouldn't exist. No blueprint had ever marked it, and no staff member could recall its history. Yet here it was, as if it had emerged from the walls themselves, a phantom realm of peeling paint and rusted metal. He hesitated. He had come this far out of nothing more than professional curiosity, driven by whispers from the older orderlies about a phantom war deep within the hospital. They claimed the door would only appear to those destined to find it. Harold had laughed at the notion then, but the pull to investigate gnawed at him, an itch he couldn't scratch. Now, standing before the threshold, the laughter died in his throat. The air here was different, thicker, damp, smelling faintly of mildew and something metallic beneath. He glanced over his shoulder, the familiar buzz of the hospital far behind him, and stepped through the door. The instant he crossed the threshold, the world shifted. The door he had entered through was gone, swallowed by the pale, endless hall stretching before him. The windows, if they were windows, showed no sky, only an indistinct fog pressing against the glass like a thick membrane. The silence here was suffocating, as if the building itself had exhaled its last breath decades ago. "Odd," Harold muttered, wiping the growing moisture from his brow. The floor creaked beneath his footsteps, the sound absorbed by the oppressive stillness. Rooms branched off to either side, each one filled with long-abandoned beds, ivy stands, and cabinets, all draped in dust. They looked as though they had been waiting for someone to return to them for years, maybe longer. And then, the first strange thing. A stack of files on a desk in one of the rooms, patient records that looked no different from the ones he used daily, except for the dates. The year written on the first file was 1946. He flipped through more. 1950, 1954. The ink was faded, the pages brittle, but there was something too new about them, as if they had only just been placed there. But it was the names that drew his attention, each one unfamiliar, yet not. They stirred a faint discomfort in the back of his mind, as though dredging up fragments of a forgotten dream. And then he saw it. His own name. Fenwick. Harold. His breath hitched. The file was dated 1951, a time before he had even been born. He opened the record with trembling hands, scanning the neat typed entries that detailed an illness. His illness. An illness he had never had. Yet the symptoms, the treatments described, each word dug deeper, stirring something primal, something buried. It wasn't just his name. There were others. Doctors, nurses, people he recognized from his current life, all listed as patients in these yellowed, crumbling files. It was impossible, but there it was. A laugh escaped him, short and sharp, echoing down the corridor, but there was no comfort in it. A memory tugged at the edges of his mind, a flash of white walls, the scent of disinfectant, the hum of lights overhead, and a bed. His bed, somewhere in the bowels of this impossible place. The lights overhead flickered, the faint buzz filling the silence. He dropped the file, stepping back, only to feel a sudden, intense cold crawl up his spine. The shadows in the hallway shifted, bending in ways they shouldn't, stretching toward him like fingers reaching out. His pace quickened, panic setting in as he moved deeper into the maze of rooms and hallways, the layout warping with each step. The hospital had become an endless labyrinth, corridors multiplying, doorways appearing where there had been none. His rational mind scrambled for answers, for explanations. Perhaps it was some forgotten wing, a trick of memory or a hallucination brought on by exhaustion. But no explanation sufficed. Not when he saw faces peering at him from the shadows, their expressions vacant, eyes too wide, too dark. He stopped in front of one of the rooms, heart pounding in his chest, when he noticed something worse than before. A bed covered with yellowed sheets lay in the center of the room. His bed. It was the same bed he had seen in the file, down to the rusted frame and cracked headboard. A faint indentation in the mattress looked eerily familiar, as if he had only just left it. And at the foot of the bed, another file. His file. It hadn't been there before. It hadn't. Fingers trembling, Harold opened the folder, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The words danced on the page, shifting and twisting before his eyes, but there was no denying the content. It detailed his arrival in this very hospital, today's date stamped in bold at the top, and the words "treatment ongoing" scrawled in unfamiliar handwriting at the bottom. The room felt smaller, pressing in on him from all sides, the very walls seeming to pulse, alive with some unknowable intent. The bed creaked as though inviting him back into its depths. Harold staggered back into the hallway, the floor swaying beneath him. There was no exit, no windows, just the endless maze stretching out before him, pulling him deeper into its clutches. He could feel it now, the hospital's hunger, the sense that it was alive in ways he couldn't begin to comprehend, its corridors and rooms growing, shifting, consuming. His footsteps faltered, the lights dimming overhead until only darkness remained. Somewhere far behind him, or perhaps all around him, a voice whispered in the gloom, soft and familiar. "Welcome home, Dr. Fenwick." The words echoed in the stillness, and Harold knew with every fiber of his being, that there would be no leaving this place. Not again.
Dr. Richard Murdoch was a man of reason, a pillar of empirical science, but even the most steadfast minds can be unsettled by the unexplainable. The White Oak Hospital, with its ivy-clad walls and air of faded grandeur, held within it the infamous Ward 13. For decades, this cursed corner of the hospital had whispered of dread. Patients admitted there invariably met untimely and inexplicable deaths, their fates shrouded in mystery, their conditions deteriorating despite the most diligent care. Murdoch, a newly appointed physician, had heard the chilling tales in hushed whispers among the staff and seen the uneasy glances they cast towards the ward. It was a place no one spoke of willingly, a place he had dismissed as mere superstition, until he found himself assigned to it, ostensibly for a routine investigation of its dark reputation. On his first day, the ward seemed unnervingly calm. The walls, covered in an aged floral wallpaper, were dull and unassuming, a contrast to the rumours of horror. The quiet was broken only by the occasional mournful creak of the old floorboards. Yet, there was something disconcertingly amiss. The air was thick with an unsettling chill, and Murdoch couldn't shake the feeling of being observed. His investigation began with the patients, each of whom had an unsettling calm about them, as if resignation had already taken root. He noticed that while their conditions worsened, they spoke less and less, their eyes becoming distant, as if they were looking beyond the confines of their hospital rooms. Murdoch dug into the ward's history. Old records revealed nothing extraordinary, just the names of patients and a litany of ailments. But there were odd gaps, incomplete entries, and increasingly erratic handwriting as he traced the timelines. Each entry seemed to grow more desperate, more fragmented, until it abruptly ended with an ominous note: "It must be fed." Determined to uncover the truth, Murdoch stayed late one night, his curiosity overcoming his mounting unease. He pored over old journals and historical accounts, only to find a pattern he hadn't expected. Every patient who died under mysterious circumstances had been there for a specific period before their demise. It was almost as if the ward had a schedule, a grim rhythm to its horrors. As he pored over a particularly unsettling journal, Murdoch felt an icy draught sweep through the room. He looked up to find that the ward's lights had dimmed to a near-complete darkness, and a soft, disquieting murmur filled the air. It was the sound of countless whispers, growing louder, blending into an incomprehensible chant. A shadow moved in the corner of his vision, a dark form that seemed to writhe and shift. Murdoch's heart pounded as he turned to face it, but the shadow vanished as quickly as it had appeared. His breath quickened, and he realized the source of the murmuring was not external, but coming from within him, a gnawing, insidious doubt that his presence was not welcomed. He looked at the patients, their faces pale under the dim light. They seemed to be waiting, expectant, as if they knew what was coming. His rational mind grappled with the dread that grew in his chest, trying to piece together the fragments of a puzzle that defied logical explanation. Suddenly, one of the patients, a woman with hollow eyes, whispered through cracked lips, "The ward hungers for a sacrifice. To save us, you must give what you value most." Murdoch felt the weight of those words press against his sanity. What could be worth such a price? The whisper seemed to seep into his bones, entwining with his fears and creating a sense of urgency that he could not escape. In the dead of night, as the ward fell silent once more, Dr. Murdoch found himself standing in the empty corridor, the weight of his decision heavy on his shoulders. The air was thick with a suffocating, malevolent presence. He knew that to solve the mystery of Ward 13 was to confront a darkness that demanded more than he was willing to give. The very nature of the ward seemed to pulse with a rhythm of its own, an unspoken truth that he might never fully comprehend. The next morning, Dr. Murdoch's office was empty, the lights still on. He had vanished, leaving behind only a note, scrawled in a hurried hand. "I could not." The ward continued its grim cycle as it always had. And somewhere in the shifting shadows of Ward 13, Dr. Murdoch's fate became a new, haunting whisper in the unending darkness that consumed Ward 13.
There's a tale folks tell round these parts, passed down from the nurses and orderlies who've worked at the old hospital on the hill. St. Dunstan's, they call it. It's been closed for years now, but sometimes on still nights, you can see a light flicker in the upper windows. They say it's Dr. Mathis at work, even though Dr. Mathis has been dead for near 50 years. It wasn't always like this. Back when the hospital was open, Dr. Mathis was known for his skill, a surgeon with hands as steady as stone, but toward the end of his life, something changed. The stories began after he died, people waking up in their hospital beds, feeling strange, different. They'd pull back the sheets to find fresh stitches across their skin, as if they'd been cut open and sewn back together in the night. But they hadn't gone under the knife, or at least they didn't think so. They couldn't remember a thing. Some folks blamed the old hospital's poor record-keeping, saying the patients had likely signed consent forms without paying much mind. Others claimed it was stress or illness, the kind of thing that messes with your head. But the ones it happened to, they knew better. They spoke of dreams, vivid and unsettling. Dreams of a tall man in a bloodied coat standing over them, tools gleaming in the dim light, murmuring to himself in a language they couldn't quite understand. The worst part wasn't the stitches, though. No, it was what came after. You see, after these strange surgeries, the patients felt something else. Not pain, exactly. More like movement. A slow, crawling sensation deep inside, just beneath the scar. Doctors examined them, found nothing out of the ordinary, but the patients swore it was there, growing. Some left town, others just disappeared. There's a saying around here, if you wake up with stitches at St. Dunstan's, don't ask what was done, and whatever you do, don't go back. But sometimes curiosity gets the better of people. They wander in, searching for answers. And if you listen close enough on those quiet nights, you might just hear the soft click of surgical tools echoing through the empty halls.
Dr. Thomas Gray had always been a man of stern reason and unshakable resolve. The old hospital where he had taken up his post was a relic of a bygone era, its towering spires and crumbling stone whispering tales of forgotten times. Its reputation was tarnished, but Dr. Gray's professional integrity and belief in the greater good led him to accept a position there, despite the murmurs of its troubled past. In the dim corridors and echoing chambers of the hospital, the air seemed perpetually laden with a faint, unsettling chill. The staff, a collection of faces, both gaunt and expressionless, moved with an uncanny, synchronized precision. Dr. Gray observed them with an unease he could not quite place, though he attributed it to the institution's age and the burden of its history. One evening, as twilight crept into the corners of the hospital, Dr. Gray discovered an old journal in a neglected storage room. The leather cover, cracked and brittle, hinted at secrets buried beneath layers of dust and decay. The journal belonged to Dr. Armitage, a predecessor whose name had become a whisper in the annals of the hospital's lore. The entries spoke in cryptic terms of the essence and the transference of the spirit. They detailed experiments on patients, described in vague and unsettling terms. The further Dr. Gray read, the more his sense of dread grew. The experiments were said to involve altering the very fabric of one's consciousness, a grotesque amalgamation of science and occultism. Descriptions of patients, once full of life, becoming mere husks, their eyes vacant and souls seemingly siphoned away, sent shivers down his spine. Dr. Gray's attempts to confront the staff about his findings were met with dismissive glances and half-formed smiles. They spoke of necessary procedures and protocols, their words coded in a sickly sweet veneer that masked something darker. The head nurse, a gaunt woman with eyes like hollowed sockets, seemed to take an eerie pleasure in his disquiet. The more he pressed, the more he felt the walls closing in around him, the shadows lengthening. It was as if the very hospital itself were conspiring to keep its secrets. His sleep grew troubled, filled with whispers and vague, nightmarish visions. The patients he once treated began to appear in his dreams, eyes wide with a pleading silence, their forms flickering between reality and phantasm. One fateful night, Dr. Gray was summoned to the basement under the pretense of an emergency. As he descended the crumbling stairs, the very air seemed to grow heavier, thick with a palpable sense of malevolence. The basement was a labyrinth of forgotten rooms and broken machinery, lit only by the flickering light of a single sputtering bulb. In one room, he found an array of surgical tools, grotesquely arranged, their edges glinting with a menacing sheen. On a metal table lay a patient, unrecognizable, their body a twisted, grotesque mockery of humanity. The staff surrounded him, their faces obscured by masks, their eyes gleaming with a disturbing mixture of fascination and anticipation. Before Dr. Gray could react, they subdued him, their movements fluid and eerily coordinated. The journal had not merely chronicled experiments, but had been a manual for what was to come. Dr. Gray's protests dissolved into silence as he was strapped to a table. The last thing he saw was the head nurse's vacant eyes and a chilling smile. The experiments began, though what transpired in those hours remains shrouded in ambiguity. Some say Dr. Gray's consciousness was fractured, his mind subjected to the very horrors he sought to uncover. Others whisper that he was transformed into one of the husks he had read about, a lost soul roaming the dim corridors of the hospital. The journal was found the next day, open to a new entry. It detailed the perfect subject and the results of a transference experiment, written in a scrawl that was unmistakably Dr. Gray's hand. The entry concluded with a chilling note. The truth of the essence has been revealed, and the cycle continues. Dr. Thomas Gray became another name in the hospital's twisted legacy, his story swallowed by the ever-expanding darkness of the institution. The staff, unchanging and indifferent, continued their work, while the hospital remained a place of whispered fears and unspoken dread, its true nature forever veiled in a shroud of unsettling ambiguity.
The first time Dr. Raymond Huxley saw the blood, it was little more than a crimson smear along the baseboards of the eastern wing. He had only been appointed head physician at Hillcrest Asylum for a fortnight, and already his nerves were worn thin by the oppressive atmosphere of the place. The building itself loomed like a carcass, its brick walls blackened with age, and the land on which it stood, sodden, tangled with brambles, seemed as though it had resisted the very notion of civilization. Hillcrest had a history, as the locals warned him, though none spoke directly of it. They spoke only in whispers, as if too much breath might summon a truth too unbearable to face. Raymond had scoffed at their warnings, attributing the unease to nothing more than superstition. Yet something about the place gnawed at him. It was late one night when he first saw the streak of blood. He had been making his usual rounds, checking on the patients who, despite the asylum's reputation, seemed almost unnervingly calm. There was a hollowness to their stares, an absence of emotion that at first Raymond took for tranquility. But as he passed the dimly lit corridor near room 13, he noticed the dark red smear creeping out from the wall. He knelt down, his breath catching in his throat. It was unmistakable. Thick, viscous, still glistening in the pale moonlight filtering through the narrow window. He recoiled, unsure of what he was seeing. The asylum was old, crumbling in parts, but there had been no reports of leaking pipes or ruptured walls. And this was not water. The next morning, he inspected the area again, but the smear had vanished. Not a trace remained. Raymond tried to dismiss it as a trick of the light, perhaps even fatigue. But as the days wore on, the blood returned, this time more pronounced, bleeding through the plaster, running down in thin rivulets, and it was never in the same place twice. He could not bring himself to touch it. Some instinct, deep and primal, held him back. He watched it, though, fascinated and repelled. Soon, the other staff began to notice. Their reactions varied from nervous laughter to outright dread, though none would openly admit their fear. After all, Hillcrest had seen its share of horrors long before any of them had stepped foot inside its walls. The asylum had once been a grand estate, or so the record said. But after a string of misfortunes, fires, disappearances, mysterious deaths, it had been repurposed as a hospital for the mentally ill. That too had ended in disaster. The previous administration had been notorious for their treatments, unsanctioned experiments and grotesque procedures. Most of the patients never left Hillcrest. Some died within weeks. Others lingered in agonizing silence, forgotten by the world beyond. Rumor had it that the land itself was cursed, though no one could say why. Only that long before the asylum stood, even before the estate, something had happened. Something unspeakable. It was the night that Raymond touched the blood, that everything changed. He had resisted for so long, but curiosity, or perhaps some deeper compulsion, drove him to it. He had woken from a restless sleep, the sound of faint, dripping liquid echoing through the halls like a slow heartbeat. As if in a trance, he followed the sound to the western wing, where the walls seemed to pulse, as though they were alive. There, in the center of the hall, the blood was flowing freely. It seeped through the cracks in the stone, running in dark streams that pooled at his feet. Without thinking, he reached out, his fingers brushing the cold, sticky surface. A flood of memories, no, not memories, fragments of agony ripped through him. He saw flashes of faces, distorted by terror, mouths stretched wide in silent screams. He felt their pain, their confusion, their madness. It was not just pain of the body, but of the mind. Something deeper, more primal. It was as though the blood held within it the very essence of those who had suffered here, trapped and unable to escape. Raymond staggered back, gasping. But the images remained. They haunted his every waking moment, the sensation of blood still clinging to his hands no matter how much he scrubbed. He began to see things, shadows that moved when they shouldn't, whispers just beyond hearing. The patients grew restless, their empty gazes now filled with something darker, something accusing. He no longer felt like himself. He could no longer sleep, plagued by dreams of drowning in an endless sea of red. His mind unraveling, Raymond found himself wandering the halls at night, staring at the stains that seemed to spread, covering the walls like a spreading infection. The asylum itself seemed to be rotting from within, as though the very foundation had been corrupted by whatever evil lay buried beneath it. One night, he ventured down to the basement, drawn by a strange compulsion. There, beneath the crumbling stones, he found what he had always known was there but had refused to acknowledge. The walls were alive with blood, flowing, writhing, and pulsating like a living thing. And in that moment, Raymond understood. The blood was not simply the remnants of those tortured souls. It was something far older, something that had been waiting, feeding off the pain and suffering of all who came into contact with it. And now it had him. The last thing he saw before his mind fully succumbed was his own reflection, distorted in the dark pool at his feet. His face was pale, gaunt, and behind his eyes, something watched. A presence that had been waiting for centuries, now fully awakened. Hillcrest Asylum stood silent the next morning. The blood was gone, and so was Dr. Raymond Huxley. The staff said nothing, but the patients, those few who remained lucid, knew the truth. Hillcrest did not let anyone leave, not entirely. And at night, if you listened closely, you could still hear the faint, rhythmic drip of blood.